In this final video, I will be commenting primarily on the principal characters of the novel and the ideas they represent. But before I get there, I should say a few words on how this work tends to be viewed as a whole in the context of Dostoevsky's career. As noted in my introduction, when Dostoevsky was wrapping up the writing of Stepanchikovo, he regarded it as the best work of his career to that point. His one misgiving was that it was a bit too lengthy, and now that we have run through it in its entirety, we can understand the concern. Part 1 in particular seems to demand some patience of the reader as we endure episode after episode of the Colonel's weak-minded, voluntary enslavement to Foma Fomitch without any sign of abating. In fact, I confess that I don't have any of the generosity of feeling that Yegor Ilyitch has for his fellow man. For me, a happy ending would have been Foma Fomitch, Madame la Générale, and Miss Perepolitsyn all being thrown out of the house on their ear, and ending their miserable days in regret in the gutter. But evicting his mother is simply not within the scope of the Colonel's character, and given his mamma's undying, idiotic loyalty to Foma, the ending we have is about the best we could have hoped for. Only Miss Perepolitsyn gets her just comeuppance, although one worries for her stepchildren. But at least our heroes achieve the happiness they deserve, a rarity in the Dostoevsky corpus. It is rare in other ways, too. The sustained comedic tone is unusual for our author, although, of course, his other Siberian novella, Uncle's Dream, is in the same mold. In fact, while I hold The Village of Stepanchikovo in higher esteem overall, I think Uncle's Dream is better at provoking a laugh. The provincial setting is less common for Dostoevsky than an urban one, and of course it may have originally been conceived for the theatrical stage. And in at least one other way, scholars typically think of Stepanchikovo as an anomaly, namely in the way it targets another author for sustained ridicule. I mentioned earlier that Foma Fomitch is in some ways a perverse representation of Nikolai Gogol in his later years, in particular as seen in his selected passages, and I noted a couple of ways in which Gogol was being targeted in the first chapter. Others have noted many more. As one more example, Konstantin Molchulsky observes that the ridiculous monument that is erected over Foma's grave is a dig at Gogol. When Foma self-righteously instructs his sycophants not to erect a monument to him, which, of course, is really a request for just such a thing, he is echoing Gogol's language. I'm not sure that Gogol really intended it the way it's presented here, and Molchulsky and others insist that Dostoevsky's treatment of Gogol is unfair. Certainly Dostoevsky's satire has a ruthless streak about it. Curiously, though, Dostoevsky still had a great deal of respect for the man as he was writing this very work. When he boasts of its virtues in a letter to his brother, he notes that, quote, "There are scenes of high comedy that Gogol himself would have signed without hesitation," unquote. And, as I noted in my introduction, the early Dostoevsky is really the work of a Gogolian apprentice. What to make, then, of the relentless lampooning of his prior tutor? The party line among scholars seems to be the one that Molchulsky offers, that The Village of Stepanchikovo marks the end of that apprenticeship, as Dostoevsky sets his sights on the novel tragedy for which he has become so famous. But to really evaluate this work, we have to examine its two central characters, around which the whole novel is built. The weaker one is surely Yegor Ilyitch. The Colonel does get his opportunities to shine, and in each case it is due to the same stimulus, namely wrong done to an innocent person. We know that he is stirred to wrath in Part 1, Chapter 8, during an offstage shouting match in defense of Nastenka's honor. Of course, it is Nastenka's honor again that prompts the climactic expulsion of Part 2, Chapter 4, although I'd say his greatest moment comes 3 chapters prior in his take-charge rescue of Tatyana Ivanovna. But when it comes to defending himself, the man is hopeless. Presumably, this is what Dostoevsky took to be his most saintly feature, being good-natured to the point of habitual self-sacrifice and boundless humility. Later on, as Dostoevsky would work on further iterations of the idea of the perfectly good man, this feature would resurface, most notably with Prince Mishkin of The Idiot. Mishkin, too, has to deal with shysters and parasites. But, contrary to the novel's title, when he gives in to them, it's not due to any cognitive failure, but to his extraordinary values, which are out of place in Petersburg society. Mishkin, like the saintly Zosima and Alyosha and Brothers Karamazov, knows exactly with whom he is dealing. Yegor Ilyitch, by contrast, is aggravatingly blind to the faults of others. His naivete can be charming at times, as with the Korovkin incident, but ultimately most readers will find him to be less appealing of a figure on account of it. The last chapter reveals another dimension of the Colonel's character, which, I think, rounds out his goodness. As he reacts to the beauty of the world in his final conversation with the narrator, he shows that he is capable of a certain kind of happiness, which involves a sort of spiritual receptivity to God's grandeur. Not all of Dostoevsky's characters have this, but the noblest of them tend to. Later on, we'll get an impassioned version of this feature in the speeches of Dmitry Karamazov. The real center of the novel is, of course, Foma Fomitch, who is sometimes called the Russian Tartuffe after Molière's famous play. I think of him as a brilliant character, but so over-the-top that he simply can't resurface to quite such an extreme in any of Dostoevsky's later works, which usually strive for greater realism. There's nothing quite like him in any of his prior works either. The 3rd episode of Natochka Nezvanova has a moralizing tyrant, but his speeches are short and dogmatic. The closest forerunner to Foma is Maria Alexandrovna, the loquacious and audacious charlatan from Uncle's Dream. One of the most obvious points of contrast between her and Foma, however, is that Maria Alexandrovna quite explicitly does not believe her own bull. Does Foma believe his? The answer isn't obvious. I've said earlier, however, that I think Foma is more delusional than deceptive. The reason is that Foma devotes his whole life to the image of himself that he has created. Maria Alexandrovna would cast off her various facades when they cease to be advantageous to her, and surely won't keep them in the privacy of her own room. But when we enter Foma's room at the beginning of Part 2, Chapter 3, we learn that during his life in the house he has composed a number of manuscripts, a couple of unfinished novels, a poem in blank verse, a meditation on the lives of the peasants, and so on. All of it, the narrator assures us, is horrible rubbish. But they are honest endeavors, as though the man really does think of himself as some great literary talent. But there is some deception going on. I've noted one instance of this in my earlier comments. However, the most high-profile example occurs in the climactic scenes. Just before flying through his own glass doors, Foma is in the middle of denouncing Nastenka as having become a most depraved girl, and in no way is planning to secure her marriage to the colonel. When he returns, he insists that if he had only been allowed to finish, he would have concluded that Nastenka is a truly noble and pure girl, and that he was only fearing for her purity in the face of the colonel's unbridled sensuality. The reader knows better. After his rough treatment, Foma decided to rethink his strategy, as bullies in such conditions typically do, and so he came back with an embellished story. So there clearly is some deception going on, but my read is not that it is deception of others so much as it is self-deception. The extraordinary absurdities of Foma Fomitch are too numerous and instinctive to be inventions that he manufactures ad nauseum to pull the wool over others' eyes. Rather, he takes it as a non-negotiable axiom that he is the great man he conceives himself to be, a general of virtue if not of military rank, and interprets all events in light of this core dogma. So, when his behavior provokes the righteous indignation of the colonel, he must immediately reinterpret his expulsion as unrighteous, and so embellish the narrative in such a way that Foma is a martyr. 10 years prior to writing Stepanchikovo, Dostoevsky had already explored the area of self-deception in Natochka Nezvanova with the character Yefimov. My own view is that Foma is a kind of psychological cousin of Yefimov. As I have noted in an earlier passage, the novel features another character who believes his own bull, namely Mizintchikov. The contrast here between him and Foma is of interest. I find Mizintchikov to be much more likable. He is competent, sees things very clearly, is businesslike, and is in no way the preening hypocrite that Foma is. And yet he promotes moral falsehood, not moral truth. Like the narrator, we are not expected to buy the justification of his elopement scheme. Despite his disgust at losing his opportunity, he is fortunate that Obnoskin steals his idea before he can sully his own reputation by taking advantage of Tatiana Ivanovna. I can't help but cheer for his success in the epilogue. But we will see roughly the same kind of moral reasoning Mizintchikov offers again in later works, where the stakes are much higher and the results not so rosy. Crime and Punishment comes to mind. Foma, for all his hypocrisy, often stumbles upon moral truth. As noted earlier, the case of Frol Silin is instructive. Foma regales the character as a noble exemplar of goodness during his pompous discourse on literature. So, too, has the narrator a few chapters earlier, except that he has accurately ascribed the virtues of Frol Silin to his uncle, the very person Foma abuses. Foma's constant haranguing of others about the importance of moderating the passions, of self-sacrifice, of forgetting oneself for others, all this is perfectly in line with what Dostoevsky himself seems to believe, and seems to expect us to believe. The problem isn't that he has the wrong ideas about the abstractions. The problem is that he can't apply them correctly to the concrete world. As the old saying goes, hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue. Mizintchikov is more like virtue paying tribute to vice. Foma goes the other way. But what made him such a loathsome figure? The first chapter gives us his backstory, and the narrator, using that knowledge, is happy to offer a theory that employs it in the two subsequent chapters. Foma is the way he is simply because of the miserable circumstances he had to endure as a kept buffoon under the misanthrope General Krahotkin. His dignity thus continually effaced, he naturally became bitter toward humanity, and, when out from under the general's thumb, predictably paid forward his bitterness toward others. If only he could be shown love and reconciled to humanity, then perhaps he would cease his bullying and become a truly noble soul. At any rate, that's the story the narrator tells falteringly to the skeptical Batchev, and then later to the enthusiastic colonel. But before the day is out, after meeting the man in the flesh, the narrator has abandoned this pet theory of his. Foma is simply a bad person, and he is not merely the damaged victim of unjust prior social circumstances. Rather, he is the output of those foul circumstances working upon a base, self-absorbed character. The novel is careful to provide us with counterexamples to the social theory, for there are other figures in it who have had it rough, and they do not all turn out the way Foma does. The narrator explicitly mentions Nastenka as one of them in the final chapter. The more obvious example is Tatyana Ivanovna, who has endured decades of degrading misery, but whose nature remains morally upright. In her case, the biggest effect of her prior circumstances is her propensity for dreaming, which might remind us of the protagonist of the earlier story, White Nights. Joseph Frank suggests that Yezhevikin is another counterexample to the social theory, although things are less obvious in his case. It is true that Yezhevikin makes some noble gestures in the novel, but the narrator tells us in the epilogue that even in the years afterward the man never abandons the impulse to mock and jeer at people. Nevertheless, this too seems to be a part of the man's nature, and not the product of his poverty. In fact, the clues suggest that the explanation goes the other way, that he lost his job because of his venomous tongue. So, the social theory with which the narrator begins is refuted by the real events he observes. People aren't who they are simply because of external circumstances. People have some responsibility over who they become. But the social theory does make a final appearance in the last chapter of the novel, as Sergei and his uncle reflect on the events of the last 2 days. By this point, Sergei is one of the few people at Stepanchikovo who still recognizes the villainy of Foma, and he has been shown in no uncertain terms that his opinion is not welcome. So, as he wishes to please his uncle, he must play along. Yegor Ilyitch makes an excuse for Korovkin's unseemly behavior by suggesting that he may have suffered misfortunes. The narrator's response is to embrace the excuse, then to expound upon the ideas of the realist school, which is the source of his original theory, and finally to quote a poem which begins with the line, "When from dark error's subjugation." In some earlier comments, I stated that Dostoevsky would take one more pointed shot at the journal The Contemporary before the end of the novel. This is that attack. The poem he is quoting was penned by the editor of that journal, and it expresses the desire of the speaker to marry a fallen prostitute, who was in her condition due to the misfortunes thrust upon her by society. Later on, the poem would be quoted at greater length in Notes from Underground. The underlying assumption here is the social theory which has just been refuted, and the effect of quoting it in this way is to make the whole thing seem condescending, as though the unfortunate should consider herself blessed to be redeemed by her moral betters. Dostoevsky here appears to be criticizing the self-satisfied airs of the naive progressives of his day. And not just the progressives of his day, but also a prior time slice of himself. For that is who the narrator really is. The Dostoevsky of the 1840s, the author of Poor Folk or the short stories A Faint Heart or An Honest Thief, is himself a member of the realist school that is criticized here. The idea with which the narrator begins is the sort of idea with which the author himself began his career. There are other similarities, too. The narrator's awkwardness and vanity before others are actually muted when compared to the excessive awkwardness and vanity of Dostoevsky in the late 1840s. But the Dostoevsky who emerged from the Siberian prison camp would never have written An Honest Thief. The naive ideas presented there were exploded by his encounter with real thieves. And as his literary opponents were bound to discover, the nervous, foppish, vain figure who was taken off to Siberia would return to Petersburg a much more formidable pugilist in the world of ideas. By 1860, the man was engaging the literati as the editor of a journal of his own, and in the next 2 decades, despite crippling difficulties both physically and financially, he would emerge as a leading voice in the roiling cultural conflict that would engulf his country. All this was in his future. I expect to present at least a part of that future, for the next fictional work Dostoevsky would produce was his first complete, full-length novel, The Insulted and Injured, which has not yet to my knowledge been presented in an audio format free of charge. Expect it to take some time for me to get it up and running. But our current Let's Read is at an end. Per usual, if you find these comments to be inaccurate or incomplete, please feel free to improve upon them in the comments section below. I thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the experience.